that have resigned, either voluntarily or asked to resign because of certain improprieties in their life, inappropriate behavior. And I thought to myself, because we're going to be dealing with that this evening, mistakes are often remembered much longer than accomplishments. I've read after at least a couple of those pastors. I've watched sermons by them. And they have done some great things. But at this point, let's face it, ministry for them is pretty much finished. I'm not saying they cannot be forgiven. No. I'm not saying that they couldn't even be used in some way. But to get back to the pinnacle of where they were probably will never happen. And the average age of these guys was, I would guess, to be around 70 years old. So that ministry for them is pretty much finished. One mistake can ruin or harm a person's reputation. The fellow that we'll look at tonight is an example of that. He's a New Testament example of David, the king. He's actually one of the Lord's disciples. His name is Thomas. And we're going to find out tonight that Thomas did some wonderful things. He really did. But you know how he will ever be remembered? As doubting Thomas, right? Let's look at his story. We're going to do so by taking 4 snapshots of his life. First, we see him courageous. Courageous. This event takes place in John chapter 11. All that we will be looking at tonight took place in the latter weeks, even days, of Christ's earthly life. Some of them will actually go beyond Calvary. But they will all have Thomas as a focus. In John chapter 11, Jesus tells the disciples that they must go to Jerusalem. Now keep in mind, again, this is in the latter stages of Christ's earthly life. the hatred, the bitterness by the worldly system, fed primarily by the Jewish religious system. Scribes, Pharisees. Now, Rome cares nothing about Jesus. Nothing. They would actually carry out the edict. The Jews could not do it unless they went through Rome, because they are under the hand and oppression of Rome. They couldn't crucify Jesus. The religious people are inflamed at Jesus. Why? He hadn't played footsie with them. He hadn't gone to the associational meetings. He didn't fall in line with the Jews, the Pharisees. In fact, he challenged them over and over and over. He confronted them. How many times do you see them come to Jesus and try to trap him? And he lays them to waste. It says they turn and walk away. So this hatred has been building up, intensifying more and more and more. To the point that they finally have come up with a way to take his life. Jesus says we must go to Jerusalem. The disciples protest. I'll use my own words. It was as though they said, Lord, do you think that's wise? Your enemies have become increasingly hostile toward you. And you're going right into the enemy territory, because that was the home base of the Jewish religion, Jerusalem. It was the Nashville of the Tennessee Baptist Convention. Lord, do you think that's wise? In light of everything that they have been plotting and planning? And Jesus says, we must go to Jerusalem. Why? Where did the crucifixion take place? Jerusalem. Where did the selling out of Jesus take place? Where did the trial take place? Where did the arrest take place? Jerusalem. Jesus had to go to Jerusalem so that the total plan of God could be fulfilled. I think that there was kind of an argument back and forth. I think Jesus would say, we're going to Jerusalem. And I think one of the disciples say, well, I think that's a bad idea. And Jesus said, we are going to Jerusalem. And another one of them probably said, Master, I don't think that's wise. And Jesus said, we are going to Jerusalem. So they're just going back and forth, back and forth. It's going nowhere. Finally, who's our subject? Thomas. Finally, Thomas speaks up. John chapter 11, verse 16. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas is rational. And he says, we're not accomplishing anything. He is headstrong on going to Jerusalem. And the proper place for us to be is with him in Jerusalem. So let us go with him. Let us follow him. That we may die also with him. Thomas is thoroughly convinced that Jesus is going to die, and that would happen. Now, this is not the greatest of faith. But I'll tell you one thing it is. It's great devotion. That's why I said a moment ago, Thomas had some good things about him. Some very good things. That took a lot of courage. He stood up and he silenced all the others and said, let's go with him. I'm fairly certain he's going to die, and we need to be with him. As far as Thomas was concerned, it would be better to die with him, get this, than to live without him. Courageous. Second, he's candid, frank, honest. John chapter 14, Jesus is given his farewell address to the disciples. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go ye know, and the way ye know. Thomas, verse 5. Thomas saith unto him, Lord, we know not whither thou goest. How can we know the way? Let me show you what's going on at this point. I believe 11 of the disciples were convinced that Jesus really was the Messiah. I don't see that in Judas. From everything that I get from the story, Judas was very greedy. He was an opportunist. He was looking for some way to make money. And he saw this association with Jesus as a possibility. But I believe at least 11 of them were convinced that he really was the Messiah, the promised of God. They had saw his miracles. They had heard his messages. And here's where they made the mistake. They were firmly convinced that he was the one who would overthrow Rome. We talked about that earlier. They were under Roman aggression. That he was the one who would overthrow Rome. He would start a kingdom on earth when he himself said, "My kingdom is not of this world." But that's not the way they looked at it. They were looking for an earthly king, earthly Messiah. They believed Jesus was, and he was, Messiah. But his job was not at that point to overthrow Rome. By the way, Rome was going to take care of its own overthrowing. It would crumble and fall apart. After he overthrew Rome, then he would make Israel great again, right? Here's the problem. Time passed, and they're very confused. They're thinking a military battle with Rome being the primary enemy. But then Jesus said things that didn't make sense to them. Because Jesus told them that they were to love their enemies. They couldn't grasp that. By the way, he fulfilled that in his own life. Hanging on the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing." He loved even those who were crucifying him. Thomas is confused, and I believe the others are as well. But he's the only one who spoke up. He said, "Lord, we know not whither thou goest, and how can we know the way?" He spoke up and perhaps said what was on the mind of the rest of them. Thomas, the candid. Thomas, the courageous. Thomas, the critical. John chapter 20 now. We actually move now past Calvary. In fact, the event that we're going to be looking at took place after Christ had been crucified and had resurrected. After he was resurrected, in keeping with his word, he appeared to 10 of the disciples. Now here's where we come up with that number. Judas is already gone. He's out of the picture. After he sold out Jesus, it began to weigh on him. The gravity of what he had done. He went back to the ones who had given him a few pieces of silver so that he could tell them exactly where Jesus would be so they could arrest him. He goes back. He takes the silver back. And in essence, he says, I have committed a wrong. Take this back. Do you think maybe Judas might have thought, if I take this back, it will undo what I have done? You think maybe he might have thought that? Maybe. What I do know is his guilt is tremendous. By the way, when he took that back, you know what they told him? What's that got to do with us? They threw it back at him. Judas turns and he goes out and he hangs himself. Which, by the way, unless a person snapped their neck, death by hanging would have been a horrible thing. Because it would have been, to some degree, slow. You would have hung there and your body grasped for oxygen to be able to breathe. But the noose or whatever that was around the neck would have restricted it to the point that you couldn't. He went out and took his own life. So, Judas is out of the picture. He died a lost man, ladies and gentlemen. Not a man who was saved and lost his salvation. He died as a man who was never saved. Never. But I said Jesus appeared unto 10 of the disciples. What's up with that? Someone is missing. John 20, verse 24. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. 10 of them are there. Hovered probably in some room hiding, expecting any moment to hear soldiers beating on the door, coming to get them because they were associated with Jesus. Thomas isn't with them. Where is he? If you find an answer to that, please tell me, would you? There isn't one. We have no idea where he was. What we do know is where he wasn't. He wasn't with the other 10. Later, Thomas returns. He's with them. And try to imagine this moment. They are so excited. They are thrilled. Thomas You missed it. We have seen the risen Christ. Just like he said he would do, he did. He arose. We have seen him. They are so excited. Thomas is having nothing of it. John 20, verse 25. But he, Thomas, said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger in the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. I've got to see his hands where they drove spikes through them, nailing him to a cross. I've got to see it. I've got to see those wounds. I've got to see that place in his side. After Jesus was crucified, it was customary for anyone who was crucified, because they struggled to breathe, it was customary for the guards to come by and to check and make sure they were dead. And they would do that by thrusting a spear into the side, which would collapse the lung. If they were not dead when that soldier finished, they would be. But they came to Jesus. And they thrust that spear into his side. You see, if they were not dead, then that would certainly kill them. And if they needed to go farther, they would break their limbs, which would keep them from pushing up as they tried to breathe. But they didn't need to do that. When they pierced his side, they realized he was already dead. By the way, they could not break his bones. You know why? Because of prophecy. If they would have broken his bones, it would have gone against Old Testament prophecy. They couldn't do that. God would not allow it. They didn't need to do it. He was already dead. I am not going to believe it unless I see the prints, unless I see his side where he was pierced. I'm not going to believe it. Thomas the courageous, Thomas the candid, Thomas the critical. We got one other. Let's look at Thomas the convinced. Yeah. Same chapter, John chapter 20. Verse 26. And after 8 days, again his disciples were within. Perhaps they're in the same place, I suppose, in hiding. 8 days have gone by since Jesus appeared to the 10. 8 days have gone by. And Thomas was with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. I love that. They have the door shut, the door's locked. And Jesus just walks right through them. He doesn't open the door. He don't beat the door down. He just walks right through it. That's great. What does he say to them? Peace. They sure needed that. Peace be unto you. But our focus is on Thomas. Look at verse 27. Then saith he to Thomas, reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands. And reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side. And be not faithless, but believing. When Thomas uttered those words, unless I see the wounds, I will not believe. Guess what? Jesus heard that. He heard that. Now, he's very busy during those 8 days. There's things, and that's a whole study by itself as to what Jesus was doing. But remember, we're talking about God here, who sees, knows, and hears everything. And when Thomas told the others, I am not going to believe it unless I see the wounds, Jesus heard that. He knew Thomas said it. That's why he said, Thomas, take your finger and here's my hand. Examine it. Take your hand, thrust it into my side where the wound was. Verse 28. And Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. He said earlier, I will not believe unless I see and I touch. Now he has seen the Lord. He has seen him. There is no reason for him to have to touch the Lord. There is no evidence whatsoever that Thomas went to him and did what Jesus offered him to do. None. Thomas had seen the risen Lord. He was convinced. By the way, Thomas would go on to be a great leader in the early church. But it's so unfortunate that we will always remember him as doubting Thomas. It's a good message in that for us. Don't let the mistakes you see in someone else necessarily cause you to lose all hope in them, okay? All right, let's stand.